So I really appreciate everybody being here today. My name is Hayden Karlheim. I'm the Operations and Training Manager with the Public Health Management Corporation. And we have a great group of people here today joining today's training. Just to let you know, today's training is a full, I think, 2 hours of a training. So right until 4 o'clock. I understand not everybody can be here for the full time. So if you have to hop off a little early, that is okay. We really do appreciate during times that Catherine and Marquita are presenting that you do remain muted. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. We'll make sure to be monitoring that throughout the training today. If you have any questions technical wise, feel free to message me, Hayden Karlheim, or just message the group and we'll make sure to answer that question. But other than that, thank you so much for being here today on behalf of the CHW Core Program. I know all of our CHWs are really excited about this topic, even though it is something, maybe grief is distressing, but it is a really good thing for us to know in kind of the work we do. So without further ado, I'll welcome Catherine and Marquita today from Uplift Center for Grieving Children. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Hayden. Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to have you all. I love seeing all of your names. My name is Catherine. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am one of the associate clinical supervisors, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been at Uplift for a little over 7 years. And I'm joined by one of our awesome team members, and I'm going to let her introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. My name is Marquita Austin. I currently intern at Uplift. I'm currently getting my bachelor's in social work at Millersville.
Thanks, Marquita. All right, everyone. We really appreciate you all being on time, so we're going to jump right in. There are a few disclaimers I want to share at the beginning, and then I'm going to share a little bit more about our organization where we work, Uplift Center for Grieving Children, in case you have any families or clients that you work with who could benefit from a referral to our services. And then we're going to get into a whole conversation talking about grief and how we support our clients in their grief. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. All right. So, a couple of things before we begin. Hopefully, you saw this note when you registered for the Zoom. But we do really want to encourage you to take good care of yourselves while we have this conversation. We are going to be spending, as Hayden mentioned, 2 full hours talking about grief. And a lot of us are grieving, right? Of course, we're going to be focusing our conversation today on how to support our clients who are grieving personally as well. And so please, please just take good care of yourself. The thing about grief is that it can kind of take us by surprise. Sometimes we're like feeling really good, feeling really steady. And then all of a sudden it can kind of get triggered or get bursted by a conversation or by a song on the radio or by a color of a hoodie someone's wearing. And so please, please nurture yourselves however that works for you. I'm a big fan of like accessible coping tools. And so while I love a good massage, there are lots of things that we can do wherever we are to kind of keep ourselves grounded. And so 3 examples of tools that I like to use that I'll share are one of them is drinking water. I have a huge bottle of water with me. I also have a Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee because that is my favorite beverage. But we know that stress dehydrates our bodies. Science has shown that, research has shown that. And so the best way of kind of moving those stress hormones through our body is just by drinking lots and lots of water. We also know that when we can bring our attention to our bodies and breath, that can help us stay more grounded. So if we're talking about grief or if we're talking about something that might trigger something traumatic for us, what happens sometimes is our bodies, it doesn't always come back as a memory, but our bodies sometimes have a reaction to it. And so maybe our breath becomes shorter, or maybe we start to lose feeling in our feet, or maybe our stomach just starts to kind of churn a little bit. And so bringing our attention to that, the goal is not necessarily to suppress those reactions, but really to just make ourselves aware of them so that we can kind of breathe and move through that. And then the last thing I'll say is sensory input is a really big thing, not only for those of us who are neurodivergent, but also those of us who are trauma survivors. And so if you have a fidget, if you have any kind of tool, if you have a texture of something that feels soft or feels grounding, or if there's pressure, like I love proprioceptive pressure. Sometimes I'll put a weighted blanket on my lap if I know that I have to have like a more emotional conversation. So those are just 3 examples of tools that work for me, but I really encourage you to find and utilize any tools that work for you. That being said, we're going to be spending the next 2 hours talking about grief and loss. And we also are going to be having this more of a conversation. And so we would love to hear your voice today. We know that grief is really different and really unique for each person. And so there's a lot of wisdom right here in the room. You all work with lots of different clients. And so I would love to hear your voice. You, of course, can put anything you'd like to share in the chat, or you can raise your hand. You can also unmute and ask a question or share a comment at any time. You don't necessarily have to wait for me to ask a question. I am going to be asking questions for discussion. I'd love to hear your voice, but there's certainly no requirement to participate verbally. If you need to keep your screen off, that's totally fine to hear your voice, however you're comfortable with it being heard. All right, any questions about any of that? All right, well, we're going to keep moving then. Thank you for that heart, Sarah. I appreciate that. Give a little bit more information about our organization in case you have any clients. And then we mentioned Marquita and I are from Uplift Center for Grieving Children. We are a small nonprofit here in the city. We've actually been around for 25 years. 2025 is our sort of 25th anniversary year. And we used to be called the Center for Grieving Children. So some folks who have been around for a while, or if you've been in the helping profession for a while, you may know us as the Center for Grieving Children. We are the very same place. So we started out of St. Christopher's Hospital for Children in the mid 90s. And then we became a nonprofit in the year 2000 as the Center for Grieving Children, Teens, and Families. That name shortened after a while. And then in 2018, we got rid of the word the and we added the word uplift. So same place, we've been around for 25 years. And we provide free therapeutic grief support groups for kids in kindergarten all the way up through high school who've experienced a significant death of any cause. And so I would say the majority of our families are grieving a death from gun violence or other forms of homicide, but we are also able to support families who are grieving a death from all causes of death. So that might be an overdose or suicide or an illness or an accident, any cause of death. Families are welcome to come to us. We also allow families to decide who is their significant person. So it might be a family member, it might be a loved one. Any relationship that is significant to a child or to a family to want to come to a grief group, that is fine with us. That doesn't have to fit within a group format. So Uplift does not provide individual therapy. What we provide instead are therapeutic groups. And so our groups are grouped by age and developmental level. So we usually have kids who are around 2 to 3 years of each other in a group. So we might have like a group for kindergarten, first and second graders, a group for the third, fourth, and fifth graders, a grief group for middle schoolers, and a grief group for high schoolers. And we do these groups in a couple different settings. One of them is that we are in schools. You can see this right here on the slide. We are in many K-12 schools around the city. We are in district schools or in charter single school. And so if you have a student or a child in your world and you think they could benefit from an in-school grief group, we may be in that school, but we may not be. It's best to just reach out to us to check. But we work really closely with school counselors and school social workers or members of the STEP team in some district schools. And then we also do these grief groups in the evening. And so those are for all families in the Philadelphia area. So families in the city can come, families in Montgomery County, Bucks County, Southern Jersey, any other area nearby are welcome to come to our evening groups. We do these evening groups both over Zoom as well as in person around the city. And all of our grief groups are free. So we don't require any insurance. We don't require any forms of payment. And so they are free for kids in kindergarten all the way up through grade 12, as well as their adult caregivers. We also provide adult caregiver grief groups, which are a really powerful space. I know a lot of the families that we support, sometimes the focus is always on the kids and how the kids are doing and what services the kids need or have. But we know that a lot of our caregivers also really need to be heard. Caregivers are welcome to join a grief group even if their child is not in an Uplift grief group, and vice versa. A child is welcome to join our grief groups even if their caregiver is not interested in joining the caregiver group at this time. And then we also provide grief groups that are completely in Spanish, and all of our groups are inclusive and affirming and trauma responsive and healing centered. That being said, the best way to get in touch with us or to refer a family to Uplift's grief groups is by calling Uplift's Philly Hope Line. So the number is right here. It's 833-PHL-HOPE, which is 833-745-4673. And this is the line that either families can call us by themselves and self-refer and sign up that way. That works great. Or if you would like to help the family make a referral to grief group, you can call us with the family. We have found that when you all or any referral source or helping professional calls us with the family, either right there if you're together in person, on speakerphone, or on a three-way call, that helps us get in contact with the caregiver so they can hear our voice from the beginning and they're more likely to show up to group versus if you give us their contact information and we just cold call them. Uh, Sometimes it's harder to reach them that way. So if you would like to help make the referral, you can call us with the family, and we'll complete the intake, and then we will schedule a phone call to finish the enrollment appointment. And because we don't have to necessarily be in any particular school for our evening families to come to grief group. Our groups are 5 weeks long, but families are welcome to stay for as many subsequent 5 week cycles as it's helpful. So some families come and they stay for 5 weeks and they get what they need. And then other families come and stay for 5 years. It really does depend on the dynamics in the family. We are not the expert on anybody's grief journey. Our kids and families are the experts on their grief journeys. And so we let them tell us what they need. And then our hours are out. Anything I just shared about Uplift Center for Grieving Children, about our grief groups, or about how to access our grief groups or how to refer a family to a grief group. No questions? Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Mr. Frazier, for sure. We will send the flyers to your email address. Absolutely. If anybody else would like these flyers, either I can send them to Hayden and Hayden can distribute them to everybody who signed up, or you're always welcome to put your email in the chat. I'm also going to put mine in the chat in case anybody has any specific questions for us, or you have like a family you want to talk about and you're not quite sure how to go about that. The Philly Hope Line, the number that's on the screen, is also a really great resource for all of you. And so if you have a family who is really struggling and you're not quite sure about how to go about talking to them about signing up for a grief group, you can also call us and just talk to us about that. So our Philly Hope Line is only staffed by our clinicians. We're the same clinicians who run our grief groups. And so you're able to call us and we can give you clinical support. We can give you recommendations. A family is welcome to call us. Even if they don't really want to sign up for grief groups yet or they're not sure, they can call us just to get some emotional support and grief support in the meantime. Or if they're interested in other resources, you can also call us as well. All right. Awesome. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Hayden. So Hayden is going to send the flyers that I send after today to everybody who signed up for the training. Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. We also have, for those of you who are interested in other resources, we have an enormous amount of resources on our website. Anybody can check that out. You can go on there right now. You don't have to wait for an email from me. But there are a lot of great tip sheets on our website about how to support youth and families who have experienced a profound loss. And so you can see on the screen, we have different scripts and resources for how to tell a child or a teen that someone has died. We have different resources for how to talk to kids about what to expect at the end of life memorials, whether that's a funeral or whether it's a janaza or any type of homegoing, any type of end of life celebration can sometimes mean that we need to know how to support our little kids and sometimes even our teens because we might think that they know what to expect, but sometimes they don't. And then a lot of our resources are also translated into Spanish. And so those are free. You can download those anytime. And then we also have a lot of different therapeutic videos on our YouTube page. I don't think I have a picture. Nope. I don't have a picture of our YouTube page, but we do have a lot of different videos on our YouTube. And those are really great resources for families to kind of look through on their own if they're really hesitant about coming to a grief group or not really knowing where to start. It's really lovely for them to be able just to watch a quick video of one of us doing an activity or doing a read aloud of one of our therapeutic picture books or something like that. So awesome. Thank you all so much. I will definitely get those flyers out. Any other questions about Uplift's grief groups or how to access them? All right, y'all. So we are going to get moving then. We're going to jump right in. And so we are here today to talk about grief and loss and how we support our clients through that. And so I think one of the most important things for us to start with is the understanding that grief comes in all shapes and sizes, right? And so at Uplift, we have a specific eligibility criteria that kids have to have experienced a significant death of a person. That being said, we know that grief can go beyond just the death of a person, right? And so I would love to hear from all of you any thoughts you have about, in addition to people who have died, what else might our clients have lost? What other losses might they have experienced or be experiencing? Let's see, Vanessa wrote housing in the chat. Yes, absolutely. Housing is a huge one. I know there's a lot going on with public housing right now in Philly. And there's just something so grounding about having a consistent place to go home to. And when that's not there, that loss reverberates through so many domains of our humanity. Divorce of parents. Yes, absolutely. Any kind of separation of caregivers, whether it's a co-parenting situation or even if it's an estrangement between a parent and a grandparent, if the grandparent's very involved in the caregiving of the child, that kind of separation can be a huge loss, right? Our kids might grieve not only the loss of everybody being together, but the loss of, okay, well, now I have to manage different homes, different rules in every home, different neighborhoods. Adults tend to have slightly different rules than each other. So that can be a lot to navigate as well. Jobs, yes, jobs, that's huge. That's huge. Not only is there the loss of financial stability with losing a job, there's also the loss of like creating meaningful work to kind of feel productive and fulfilled by the end of the day. And a lot of folks who have gone through trauma, I know I'm one of these people, I really rely on structure. Like I really need something that gets me up and moving in the morning and moving through my day. Otherwise, I don't always structure my own time on my own as well as I could. And that's just part of sometimes what it means to have experienced trauma. Friendships. Yes, I'm so glad that you mentioned friendships because I think that that is something that we don't spend enough time kind of honoring and acknowledging in our society. There's a lot of stuff out there about the loss of a significant other or like a marriage or a life partner, but we don't always talk about the loss of friendships. And sometimes friendships are longer than any of those other relationships, right? They might see us through decades, through multiple parts of our lives. And so those losses, it's not always recognized by our society, but those can be huge losses. Family pet. Yes, that is huge. I can't tell you how many pets we have heard about in our grief group. No kids come to grief group because only a pet has died. They always have had a person, at least one person who's died. But pets come up all the time, right? Pets are this like unconditional source of comfort and of joy and love. And a lot of times, especially our teens who might be like prickly or might not be as like physically affectionate or might not want hugs, sometimes the animal in their life is all the physical affection that they need. Emotional support. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The loss of emotional support can be really huge, right? There's a really great book called, we're going to share a quote from it later in the slides, but It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And it talks about how everybody's grief is going to be different, right? Everybody on the screen, we're all going to have different experiences in our grief. All of our clients are going to have different experiences in their grief, but all of us have kind of this universal need for our grief to be seen, for our grief to be heard. Whether or not we may acknowledge that it needs that, it usually does need that for that grief to move through us. And so the loss of any type of emotional support is really big. Sickness, yes, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. So, anybody who lives with a chronic health issue or a disability of any kind, there can be so much loss associated with that, right? Loss of control, loss of agency, loss of independence, right? Loss of before I, like kind of before and after, those huge life events can kind of create into like before I could do this, this, and this for myself. And now there's a loss of that, right? Like there's a change, a lot of change involves some level of loss. Sexual abuse. Thank you for mentioning that. So, a lot of times when it comes to different forms of abuse and different forms of trauma, there is loss kind of at the center of a lot of that abuse and a lot of that trauma, right? And so we have a profound loss of safety with sexual abuse or other types of abuse. We have a profound loss of control, a loss of trust, right? And those losses can permeate other relationships, even beyond the person who is perpetrating that abuse. And so I think not all grief is going to be traumatic, but pretty much all trauma has some form of loss in the middle of it. Let's see, Vanessa wrote loss of self-worth and lost your mind. Yeah, absolutely. As somebody who is grieving, I can absolutely relate to that. There are moments where you just feel like you don't feel like yourself, right? Like grief kind of fundamentally changes us. Sometimes for those of us who are trauma survivors, we might have a day where we're really activated or we're a little dissociated from our bodies. And there are definitely moments where I'm like, have I lost my mind? Like, have I? And we haven't. It's just that's how grief looks sometimes, right? It's really a roller coaster. And I think sometimes our society expects grief to be this thing that gets better and better with every passing day and easier with every passing year. And that's just not how grief works, right? That's not the reality. Those of us who are grieving, we know that. But when we're told that that's how it's supposed to work, and that's kind of the messaging and the stigma that's out there, it can feel like, oh, well, am I the one that's losing my mind? No, this is just grief. This is normal for grief. But there's not a lot of places in our culture that really allow for that part of grief to actually be and seen as normal. Thank you all so much for all of that insight that you shared. Anything else? Who can help me? Absolutely. Absolutely. So we see that a lot with our kids. We do all of our own program evaluation at Uplift. We analyze our kids' responses to post surveys ourselves. We're trained in qualitative data analysis. And a lot of our kids, we were just meeting about this morning, a lot of our kids said that in our grief groups, they learned that there actually are people that they can go to and talk to. Not only that they're allowed to access that and they're allowed to talk about their feelings, but also that adults that are trustworthy really do exist. And so when kids don't have that or families don't have that, right, that isolation can be so profound, right? Like I always think about trauma as like two parts, right? There's the trauma of what happened, right? The loss of who died, who we lost, right? That's profound and that's huge and it kind of changes everything forever. And then there's another layer of trauma that can happen, which is the silence that follows after, right? Which is why we know that talking about loss, talking about trauma, talking to kids about what they're going through, asking people how they're feeling, however uncomfortable and awkward it may feel, that those conversations really, really matter because if there's just silence and everybody around you is expecting you to proceed as though this life-altering thing didn't just happen, that creates a whole other layer of trauma, right? Where there's like gaslighting and kids and families might start to doubt their own feelings or like their own experiences, and that can lead to a whole other host of issues. So I really appreciate you mentioning that, Vanessa. The only other thing I was going to mention here is yes, trust issues can be really big, right? Not just who to trust and who's trustworthy and how to evaluate trustworthiness, but can I trust myself, right? If kids have gone through enough loss and if they have been told enough times, no, it's your fault. It's your fault that that happened, or you should have said no, or you should have done this. Kids will start to doubt their own ability to trust their own thoughts and feelings. And that can grow into adults who don't understand how to have strong boundaries or don't feel like they are allowed to say no when they need to, right? And so these things can accumulate and become more complex as we get older, which is one of the reasons it can be so critical to talk about grief when we are supporting families. Even if it's awkward, even if you don't know what to say, we're going to talk more about that. The thing that people usually remember is who moved through that awkwardness and that discomfort of theirs to sit in this grief with me, right? It doesn't have to be for an hour, even if it's for 5 minutes, who showed up enough to actually put it out there and talk about it. Because that's usually what is going to be most meaningful to grieving folks. And that also helps mitigate and prevent a lot of those long-term issues that we talked about. The only other thing I was going to mention was experiencing oppression, whether that's racism, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, ableism. A lot of those forms of oppression can result in our own grief experiences, right? That loss of safety, that loss of identity, like that loss of control, but also just not knowing who can I trust, right? That kind of scanning any environment for safety. All of that could lead to a grief experience. All right. I think we talked about a lot of these already. Something else I just wanted to mention was like the loss of routines and traditions. I think that is a really big thing, not only for kids. We know that kids thrive with consistency and predictability. That's one of the number one ways to help create a healing environment for kids, even outside of a therapy office. Environments that are consistent and predictable, where kids know what to expect, those are healing in and of themselves, right? And so if I've had an abusive boss for many, many years, and I have a new boss who's fair, who listens, who isn't reactive, right? That can be healing, even if we never talk about traumatic stuff that's going on in my life, but just the corrective experience of having someone who's reliable and trustworthy, that can be healing in and of itself, right? And so when we think about grief and we think about our families who are grieving, sometimes those traditions, whether it's a holiday season or whether it's something they do on the first day of school or the last day of school, all of those traditions can sometimes change when there's been a huge death, right? If the person who always makes the pancakes on the first day of school is not there, who's going to make the pancakes? Do we still do a pancake tradition? Do we shift that into a different tradition? What do we do on their birthday? What do we do on their anniversary, right? All of those things can come up, and I think one of those things about traditions is in the moment, sometimes they can feel small, but after there's been a huge loss, we have to figure out and reevaluate what traditions do we want to keep? What do we want to change? And while they may feel small in the moment, they really do anchor us to our daily life or to kind of the evolution of the seasons throughout the year. And I think that those losses can be huge as well. All right. My next question for you all is how might kids and families be grieving the loss of people who did not die? So how could our clients lose a person who has not died? Again, you can use the chat, you can unmute, whatever you like.
Incarceration.
Thank you for that, Aubrey. Absolutely. So having a loved one who's incarcerated can be a huge loss, right? And there's a lot of complexity with that loss because we don't always know when it's over, right? Sometimes we're not given accurate information. Sometimes for kids, they might hear adults saying different things about how long they have to wait. And we also know that, particularly for families who have a loved one incarcerated, we know that continuing that connection and staying in touch regularly is one of the most important things to help kids kind of move through that with as much resilience. But we know that a lot of prisons are very far away and there's not great transportation there. And so a loved one who's incarcerated can be a huge loss. Absolutely. Let's see. In the chat, we also, whoops. In the chat, we also have addiction. Yes, absolutely. So, of course, addiction could result for some families in a death, but I'm really glad you mentioned it when we're talking about non-death losses, right? Because addiction is often called a family disease. I mean, I don't personally love the word disease, but addiction is really a medical and scientific thing, right? That's kind of in people's genes. And when we have an addiction in a family or we have like kind of a family dynamic, a lot of times what happens is that we will assume different roles to kind of keep the peace as much as possible, right? And our kids absolutely are a part of that. We also know that if we have a loved one who is struggling with active addiction, even if they're standing right in front of us, they're not the person we know. They're not the person we love. They're not the person that we've known for all these years, right? They kind of change and they kind of go away in a way that can feel like they've died, even though they're standing in front of us, right? So that change of who we knew and who we loved, that loss is really there. Let's see, parents, boyfriend, girlfriend that break up. Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of our kids also like our younger kids who have like older cousins or older siblings who have a really significant other, a really like stable, significant other, that breakup can be huge. I've had many young kids come to me and say like, oh yeah, like she was kind of my cousin, they were dating, but I felt like she was a member of my family and now that breakup has happened. And so it can affect a lot of different layers of those relationships. Mental health struggles. Yes. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Um, let's see. Separation. Yes, absolutely. So whether that is from the foster care system or child welfare, whether it's from immigration, right? There's so many different reasons that separation can happen. And there's always, always loss there. It's so important. I do these trainings with folks in the child welfare system as well who work with kids in foster care. And even if a primary caregiver is not biologically related, and even if a primary caregiver is not safe to a child, the attachment of what happens when a baby or a young child is attached to an adult in their lives, however unsafe they may be, that loss is present, right? Even if they're safer without that person, or even if that person was very stressful or very violent to them, we know that there's still a loss there because attachment gets encoded into our cells, right? And so there is going to be a loss. That grief is going to be more complicated. It's going to be a lot more nuanced, and often it's going to be different than other kids who have had the loss of someone who was very loving and very nurturing and very safe, but it is still a loss, right? So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Abuse, whether that's physical or emotional, yes, definitely. So, like I mentioned, a lot of trauma has at the center of it loss, right? We have to grieve the loss of safety. We have to grieve the loss of control. We have to grieve the loss of agency. We have to grieve that maybe someone we trusted became untrustworthy, right? We have to grieve whoever allowed it to happen, if, especially if we were a kid, right? If somebody else was aware of it but didn't stop it. A lot of that has a lot of layers. And I find that especially when we are thinking about trauma and grief, where there's a loss at the center of it, sometimes as adults, we might be doing, so I talked about like the loss of control, right? There's a lot of us who might be doing different things to kind of compensate for that loss of control as a kid, where it doesn't might not have anything to do with abuse. It might just have to do with like, this is how everything has to be for me. I'm very rigid about this, or I can't be flexible about this because we're not grieving the loss of that control that happened at a really fundamentally young age, right? And so the grief at the center of that is so huge. I have a mentor who always says, unaddressed grief runs our world, and I just think that that's so accurate. Let's see. One in the chat. One can lose a person who didn't die by the very fear of loss itself. One parent dies and you're fearing that the next will go. Yes, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. So fear of loss is huge, right? Particularly for kids who we know have a very vivid imagination. And we know that kids, if one thing happens, sometimes kids will not know if that's going to happen again, right? And so I've had many kids who have had one caregiver die and they might be so fearful about the other caregiver dying that they might try to control that even if they can't control it, right? Because kids are you're young, there's some magical thinking there. Kids often, like, it's kind of like how a toddler will be like, the sun is in my eyes, sun, go away. A 3-year-old can't control the sun, right? But a 3-year-old is so egocentric. For a minute, they think that maybe they can. And so if we have a kid who has had one huge significant loss, especially of a primary caregiver, and they're scared about losing the other caregiver or another adult in their lives, they may try to control everything within their control to prevent that loss from happening, even though they're not that powerful, right? And so I've had kids who have said, Miss Catherine, like this person died in my life, and this person, I worry about them dying. And so I have to be really, really good, and then she won't die. Right. And so the kid had already kind of conflated that idea of their behavior being connected to an outcome of death. Those two things aren't related, right? And it's my job in that role to help them see that I can see why you might have that connection because you're scared and you want there to be something you can control, but you can't control when another person dies, right? And it's okay if you make mistakes, right? Like that level of perfectionism that a kid could hold themselves to could end up having a more harmful long-term effect. Let's see. Carmen wrote, sometimes kids will self-mutilate when they experience a loss. Yes. So sometimes self-harm can happen, right? Especially if kids are trying to cope and they don't have a way of coping, right? And so when there is a buildup of emotional pain and there's nowhere to release that pain, there's no one to talk to, there's no one they feel comfortable sharing their pain and their grief with, sometimes that can lead to self-harm, and that can be in lots of different ways, right? It doesn't have to just be in self-injury. It could be in kids like not taking care of themselves. It could look like young adults or adults like not wanting to go to the doctor if they're sick. Self-harm is an umbrella term. It can mean lots of different things. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Someone who is paralyzed, yes, absolutely. That can be a loss. Experience, yep. Culture and roots, yes. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Claudine. I think when we think about families or clients of ours who have experienced immigration, there can be profound losses there that might not have anything to do with one specific person, right? But just the loss of their roots, the loss of having to be in a country that's not ours, right? Like the culture, the understanding, sometimes language. Sometimes just that feeling of safety, right? Of like, oh yeah, like these are my people, this is my home. A lot of that can be a loss, right? When we don't have to get to experience that as often. Let's see. Some additional language, chaotic substance use versus addiction. Oh, thank you for that, Aubrey. I have not heard chaotic substance use before. I appreciate that. Child end of in care due to parent neglect. Yes, so parental rights being terminated in child welfare, that can be a huge loss, even if a child hasn't lived with that caregiver for many years. Just the knowledge that not only, okay, well, there's the loss the of the parent that's already very pervasive, right? They haven't been living with them. But then there's also sometimes the loss of that hope of like, oh, well, I was hoping one day, right? One day we could get there. One day they could get their rights back, they could get me back. And that's going to look different for every kid, right? Some kids really want to go back to their bio parents, some do not. But parental rights being terminated usually are some type of huge loss for sure. A caregiver starting a new job or shift change or increase in demand for caring for a sick family member. Yes, Anna, I'm glad you said that. Caregiving is a huge job, right? I'm a primary caregiver. It is a huge job, particularly when there's no finite end to it, right? And so if you have a member of your family who has a chronic illness or they're sick, if someone's older, right, and you know that they're just going to continue needing more and more help, we don't have enough caregiving resources in our society. We simply don't, right? Other countries do, we don't. And so I think that idea of like, how does that change the family dynamics? We might have a kid who's like, oh yeah, like my mom used to always do this with me, but now she's always having to take care of Pop Pop. And so like, we don't get to go to the diner anymore. We don't get to go for our walk anymore. That can be a real loss, right? Like that's not just a walk or a trip to the diner. That's one-on-one time. That's individualized attention. That's affirmation and unconditional love and all of that like sacred quality time together that kids often thrive on from us. And grandparents with Alzheimer's, yes. Thank you so much for that. So if we have a loved one who is physically standing in front of us, we know if they're experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's, they might physically be there, but they're not really emotionally and mentally there the way that we know them to be. And that can be just excruciatingly painful. Absolutely. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for sharing all of that insight. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? All right. So, that all being said, when we think about grief and loss, we are, of course, talking about people who have died, and we're talking about all the other types of loss you all just mentioned. So, that being said, let's talk about grief. Let's talk about what that word is. What is grief? I'm going to ask you all this because you're so insightful. If you had to describe grief or if you had to define grief, how would you do it? What would you say? And there's no wrong answers. I want to put that out there right now. There's no wrong way to describe grief because it is going to be very unique and different for each person. And so, no wrong way to say it.
I think grief can look so different based on capacity. Um, I think every relative capacity is faced with having a feeling of withdrawal, right? So something is missing. I don't necessarily know that we can define grief as sadness or pain narrowly. Grief can simply be the inner self facing what comes next.
Mm. Thank you for that, Aubrey. That was very poetic. So I heard something or someone is missing. I heard we wouldn't want to define it too narrowly, right? To just like one emotional experience and the inner self kind of facing what's next. I feel like that is a huge part of grief, right? Like not only I have to grieve this person not being here with me, how on earth am I going to do that? But like also how on earth do I live as myself without them, right? When we have fundamental sacred people who are a part of who we are and they die, right? Like it's really hard to imagine a future without them. And so that's a huge part of working through grief is figuring out how do I carry their legacy forward? How do I kind of come to terms with this new identity that I have? Because grief changes us, right? And we don't go back to the person we used to be. We change and we kind of carry that grief with us. Let's see, I'm missing things in the chat here. Let's see. A response to loss. Yes, yes. I love that phrase. Because I think with grief, sometimes our society doesn't realize that grief is a natural response to loss, right? Like that is so there is nothing more natural in the world than loving and grieving, right? It is just such a part of human connection, and we need connection to survive. That's the kind of species we are. And so a natural response to loss, I really appreciate that. Let's see. Being sad, losing somebody. Yep, absolutely. So sadness can be a huge part of grief for sure. Um, there's a lot of other things that can come with grief too, but sadness can be a huge part of it. Grief is losing the potential of a future connection with a person or thing. Yes, thank you for that, Hayden. Yes, we're grieving not just the person they are to us and all of the past memories that we have, but also this whole future that we thought we were going to get with them. Even if that loved one is 94 years old, we always could have wanted more time if that was a positive relationship, right? And so, even if we knew it was coming, even if that person lived a long life, we are still going to grieve very deeply for them. Let's see, pain and discomfort from loss and adjustment to that loss. Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of discomfort with grief, right? Not only in how we actually have to move through the emotions of it, but also we have to deal with everybody else's discomfort because we live in a society that profoundly stigmatizes grief and death and loss. And so that means that sometimes other people are so uncomfortable with grief that they become uncomfortable with us as grieving people. And sometimes we might even lose relationships for that, or we kind of see very clearly who's ready and willing to sit in that loss with us and who's not. Sarah, yes, I see your hand up, and then I'm coming back to the comments in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do actually a grief talk with my members every first Thursday of the month. And the thing that I'm always hearing is the sense of sorrow. Like if you could find words that mean physical, like pain, but that's not physical. Like if we could figure out how to use it in words, when somebody says my my heart hurts or my leg hurts. I'm feeling this throbbing. If we could find those words to
Mhm.
say how they're feeling, it's like in a pain without the pain. Like I always hear words like sorrow, like just sorrow or mad, or like I feel like the definition of it is so crazy. Like, um, so it's intense. It's an intense feeling of missing something and you can't quite put your finger on what they're saying or how they're feeling, but they don't know how to go on,
Mhm. Absolutely.
and it can be people saying this, talking about their mothers from 2 years ago, so.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So there is no timeline for grief, right? It doesn't matter if it was yesterday, if it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Sometimes it will feel like it just happened, right? Like that's kind of the intense roller coaster-ish of grief. Like you don't know when that moment those moments are going to come up. And I appreciate you mentioning, Sarah, this idea of like almost the somatic experiences of grief, right? Like my heart hurts so much it is breaking. Like it feels like it is physically breaking and shattering into pieces, right? Because we don't have enough vocabulary in the English language to encompass all of the different levels of pain, right? We have the word pain, we have different words for different emotions, but it can be very difficult to find language to come out and be able to express like just how intense and just how pervasive and just how out of control it can feel, right? And so when we work with our clients, especially with our kids, I think one of the most important things to do is to help them find language to express it, even if part of that language is this is more than I could ever say, right? Some of that is that, right? Like there's not necessarily always a release. Sometimes it can feel like a release, but when we are able to say the things and put them into words, that can be a huge part of healing because all of a sudden this thing that was so bad and so scary and so unmentionable, it becomes something that we can talk about, right? And so it's not going to go away. The grief is not going to go away, but it can help it feel a lot more manageable just to be verbalizing it. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Let's see, back to the chat because I missed some of these. Carmen wrote, being hurt without knowing how to stop it. Yes, yes. There are a lot of things that we may do to try to stop grief, right? And some of those may or may not be very healthy. We're going to talk about coping a little bit later on. But I think one of my favorite quotes is that the only cure for grief is to grieve, right? Like you can run away, you can numb it away, you can overwork, you can avoid it, but it is going to find us, right? It is going to find us. And I think just finding ways to tend to it over the course of our days and our lives and figuring out how to carry it with us, not like this is all of me, but this is part of me, right? Like this person is part of me. And so I carry that grief with me as part of me. Let's see what else is in the chat. A feeling of pain, hurt, and the unknown. Yes, the unknown can be really scary, especially if you've also experienced trauma. And so for trauma survivors, sometimes when we look at unknowns and a future, it can be hard to imagine that with a generous interpretation, right? Because our brains want to protect us. And so we might think of like the worst case scenario, even if that's not what's coming to bear, even if that's not the truth, the unknown can be especially terrifying if we have other layers of trauma. Intense sorrow, especially resulting from death. Yes, yes. Unmoored, looking up, oh, that's a great word, Anna. Looking up that definition, insecure, confused, or lacking contact with reality. Yes. Wow, unmoored. It almost feels like you're kind of unanchored, right? Or untethered. Especially when you lose somebody who is just, again, like that huge part of your world, almost like your day to day. That can be so upending, right? It's hard to find the words for it. Let's see. Renita wrote fear, loss, pain, unknown, sorrow, internal sadness, and confusion. Yes. Yes, absolutely. That confusion is really important, I think, to mention. We don't always know what happened. Sometimes we have questions that there are no answers for, right? So we might have kids who are like, well, why my person? Why my person and not somebody else's person? I don't have an answer for that, right? I don't control the universe. I don't decide who dies and who doesn't. And so I think there's that kind of like existential confusion coupled sometimes with like the no, but for real, what happened? Like this doctor told me one thing, but this other doctor told you a different thing. Or like if our kids are trying to put something together and all they have to go off of is what the adults are saying to each other, right? If we're not stopping to take the time to like sit with a child and explain what happened, a lot of times it's confusing for kids because they're trying to put the puzzle pieces together, right? Well, Pop said this, and my uncle said this, but my mom said we're not supposed to talk about it. And so they're trying to fit all of these pieces together to formulate what happened because we are all going to reach for the answer to the question, why, right? We like control. We especially like control in the middle of trauma. And so figuring out what actually happened, that confusion can be very unnerving. Let's see, numbness, and even feeling helpless. Yes, absolutely. Feeling left behind or like the world is going on and I am stuck. Yes. Michelle, that is really accurate, right? I think we hear that a lot from our families and kids at Uplift. This idea of society does not think about grief as a lifelong experience, right? Like you go to the greeting card aisle, and there's all these cards that are like, may these memories comfort you during this time. I've met a lot of grieving people. A lot of them are not feeling comforted by anything, right? And especially right after someone dies. And when we have a society that's built off of this idea of, okay, like you have the mourning period for a few days and then everything is just expected to go back to normal. But that's so incongruent with how grief actually works. We start to feel like, okay, well, I guess I am the one who's stuck here. Everybody else seems to have moved on. We don't talk about it anymore. No one asks me how I feel anymore. But it just happened, and like I'm now facing the reality of like, oh, I have to live my whole life without them. Like I have to figure out this whole other scheme of how to be in this world without them. But we don't have a lot of places in our culture where that's recognized for the intensity that it is, right? And we see that in things like bereavement leave. A lot of places only do a few days for bereavement leave. Some places don't do any bereavement leave at all, right? Like that stigma and how taboo grief is kind of gets institutionalized throughout our society. Let's see. Unexplainable feelings of every feeling. I love that, Renita. Yes, there is every possible feeling that's possible for a human to experience. People will experience it in grief. We not all experience all the same feelings, but someone will. Let's see. Aubrey, shame and guilt. One of the hardest things on the process I walk with folks on is when they hit a wall of free. Often the grief feels comfortable in a strange way, right? Like it comes and it's natural. It feels untrusted in oneself at times to move over the hump. Yes. Oh my gosh, Aubrey, thank you so much for that. That was really beautifully put. Something happens in our grief groups, in our evening grief groups especially, where if we have kids and families who are coming to grief group for multiple cycles, right? Sometimes we've had them for several years at a time. What happens is if a family, this doesn't always happen, but it does sometimes. If a family is like, you know what? I think we're good. I think we got what we needed from grief group. Grief group was a really big part of our lives for a few years there, but I don't think we need it anymore. There is such a difficulty a lot of our families have with how do we say goodbye to grief group? Does that mean we're saying goodbye to our grief? Does that mean we're saying goodbye to our person? What does it mean for me to be a person who doesn't need grief group anymore? What does it mean that grief is not consuming my every thought? What does it mean that there's also room for me to just be myself, to have fun, to explore new interests? What does it mean that grief is a part of me, but not all of me, right? And so, especially if we've experienced trauma, there can be it's not a real danger. It's not an accurate danger, but it can feel like danger of like, oh no, but my pain is the only thing that's anchoring me. And so that experience of joy or expansiveness of grief after we've had time to process and we've had time to very much sit in that rawness and we want to incorporate additional things into our life. And grief was always still going to be there. But I think that idea of like, oh, well, am I allowed to even be enjoying this? Am I allowed to have fun? I think that can be very, very real. And it can be something that people really have to reckon with, right? Thank you so much for that, Aubrey. All right. That was all so insightful. You all have such a way with your words. I really appreciate it. Our definition of grief is going to be pretty simple compared to all of the insight that you all shared, but I do encourage you to use it with kids and families if it's helpful. And so because grief is so complex, right? A lot of us took our time to really think about how would we define grief, and we're adults, right? So you can imagine it's even that much more difficult for kids. At Uplift, we like to use like sort of a linguistic framework, aka a grief definition, to really help kids understand like the psychoeducation of grief. And this can extend to adults too. There's a lot of adults who might not have ever been taught what grief is. And so we really love this definition because it is very simple, but it's all inclusive, right? I think it was Renita who mentioned that unexplained feelings of every feeling, right, in the chat. So when we say, when we talk about grief, we say that grief is all the thoughts, feelings, and behavior that happen to us after someone dies or after the loss of someone or something, right? And so when we use that definition, whether it's with kids or adults or teens, we can, because it's so inclusive and it's so expansive, any feeling in the world can fit underneath that, right? Any possible feeling can fit within that. Any possible experience, feeling, behavior can fit within that, right? And of course, we know that grief is not just when someone dies. So that's why we have expanded it to the loss of someone or something. And we also have the words in here that you'll see is that grief is all the thoughts, feelings, and behavior that happen to us. And I think those are really important words to use. They can be very validating for us to use those words with clients because we don't usually control all of our feelings, right? I have yet to meet someone who has full mastery over everything that they feel. The most evolved, self-actualized, emotionally intelligent people that I know are ones who have a really deep self-awareness of what they're feeling. They sit with those feelings, they figure out what those feelings are trying to tell them, and then they manage and take care of those feelings so that way it does not consume them or become so overwhelming, right? But those feelings are not usually something that we pick and choose. They just kind of happen. And so I think that idea of using language of like grief happens to us can be really powerful. Now, of course, we get to choose how we want to cope with it, and we're going to talk about that later. But I think just the emphasis that we don't always get to control grief, right? Grief does not always get to be on our terms, right? I have one of my colleagues who I still work with actually. We have a very funny story on her birthday where we were celebrating in the office. This was years ago, pre-COVID. And I just had a accumulation of factors that had happened that morning. And I was just kind of a mess by the time I got to the office. And I didn't have any groups or I didn't have any clients. But I went into the office and everybody was singing happy birthday for her. And as soon as I heard it, I just burst into tears. It was like, happy birthday. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, this is not the kind of, like vibe you're going for. And she was like, no, I get it. I've done it before. Like, it really can take us by surprise. And I think that's the thing, like sometimes we can identify what triggered it, whether it was a song or a date, or somebody even like having similar mannerisms to someone that we love. But sometimes we can't find the trigger, and that can also be a little unnerving because we're like, well, what's wrong? Is anything wrong? No, that's just correct for grief. That is exactly how grief works. Sometimes there is no rhyme, reason, or explanation. Sarah, do you have your hand up again, or is it from earlier?
Sorry,
Oh, you're totally fine. Okay, nothing new?
not
Okay.
yet.
Not yet. Okay, great. All right. So, y'all, we are going to do a little bit of a brainstorm. You all already started to name a lot of the different feelings that we might have in our grief and that our clients might have. We're going to write some of those out right now. And then after we do that, we're going to check in. So be thinking about this in advance. I'm going to ask you all if you want a 5-minute break, because sometimes this can feel heavy and it can feel helpful to get a little break away from the screen. Or if you want to keep moving, sometimes it's easier if we have momentum just to keep the conversation going. I'm going to ask you all to pick, but you have a few minutes to think about it before I ask you. Okay, so that being said, let's talk about grief in a brainstorm. So we are going to think about all of okay, thanks for your vote, Vanessa. I will definitely take that into account. So when we say that grief is all the thoughts, feelings, and behavior that happen to us after someone dies, we also know that everybody's grief is going to be very different, right? I'm going to have a very different grief experience than even people in my life, even people in my family. Even if we had the same person who died in common, I'm still going to have a different grief experience. Now, this, of course, can come up in families, right? We've had families where a really significant person died and one kid or one family member really wanted their photo everywhere. They wanted to print them up. They wanted them on the walls. They wanted them on the banner. They wanted them on the mantle. They wanted them everywhere. And then we had another family member who would go around and put them all upside down because it was just too difficult for them to look at. And so that's the thing, like neither one of them was correct or incorrect in their grief. They were just doing what grief felt like was true for them, right? And so in those moments, we have to figure out as a family, how can we negotiate all of this? How can we make sure everybody gets their needs met? How can we still make sure so-and-so can see photos while so-and-so has a break from photos at the same time, right? And so when we do this brainstorm together, what I'm going to ask you to keep in mind is that grief is so different and so unique that if you hear someone say something and you're like, oh yeah, no, like that was not true for me, you're not doing it wrong and neither are they, right? And I find that when we have this kind of approach of like different is not only good, it's also just necessary and it's a matter of fact, there's often a lot less competition and scarcity when we talk about grief, right? And so sometimes folks ask me like, oh, well, is there any like Do kids ever compete about their grief, like in grief group? Like, it's like, oh, my grief is worse or harder or better than yours, or like, no one has gone through what I've gone through. And do they ever get competitive about, like, well, mine was the hardest? And I say, like, well, not usually. Every once in a while it might happen, but not usually because we spend so much time emphasizing that everybody's grief experiences are different. No one's are wrong. It doesn't mean that someone's stronger or weaker. It's just different. And that there's enough care in this group to go around so everybody can feel heard and everybody's story matters. And so I'm going to say that all to you as well. When we do this brainstorm that we're going to start in a second, if you hear something and you're like, oh, yeah, that's not really true for me, or I've never met anybody who has had that experience, that's totally fine. They're not wrong. The person who said it on the screen is not wrong. And I also hope it can give us just kind of like, because there's some experiences I know in my own grief that I don't have. And so when I hear about other people's experiences, it does remind me like, yeah, it just kind of brings perspective of we are wired differently. We're going to have these different experiences and they may change as we grow and change as well. All right. So how might our clients feel and what might they experience after a very significant loss? We've talked about some of these already in the chat, but what else? When we think about grief being all the thoughts and feelings and behavior that happen to us after a really profound loss.
Anger.
Anger. Sarah, thank you. Let's talk about anger for a minute. Why is anger normal and natural? It's a feeling. Thank you for that, Vanessa. It's a feeling, right? I love that you gave me a simple answer because it was a simple question. So anger is a feeling just like every other feeling, right? And feelings are a necessary part of being human. But we live in a society, and Michelle, you just mentioned it stems from hurt and disappointment. Yes, anger can, absolutely. Anger can be accompanied by a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, a lot of disappointment, a lot of betrayal, right? We also know that we live in a society that has profoundly stigmatized anger. And so a lot of our kids don't know that they're allowed to be angry, right? Because especially for our Black and Brown kids, we know that there's a lot of criminalization of grief responses, especially when it comes to anger, right? But anger is normal. Anger is necessary. There's a lot to be angry about if you've had a lot of loss. Plus, if you're just alive in 2025, there's a lot to be angry about. But that's for another day. And so when we think about anger, it is so important, especially when we're working with a family who has kids of any age, to talk about, yeah, of course you must feel angry. This is not fair, right? There's that idea of like that not fair, that the inequity, the injustice of all of it. And so a lot of our kids will make the connection of angry equals bad. And it's our job in any role that we have in supporting any family, it's okay to be angry. What we're going to work on is finding safe ways for you to manage that anger, right? Finding safe ways for you to handle that anger, finding ways to get it out of your body and to express yourself and get it off your chest in a way that doesn't hurt you and doesn't hurt anybody else. Because those things exist, right? Whether they're sports, whether it's music, whether it's writing, whether it's reading, whether it's talking to somebody, there's a lot of different ways we can get that anger out and we can move through it. But if we try to suppress anger, that's usually when it comes out and it hurts others, right? And so we really have to make sure that we're kind of prioritizing that idea of telling kids and families there's nothing wrong with anger and it's normal. We just want to all find safe ways to deal with that anger that doesn't hurt us and doesn't hurt someone else. Okay, let's see. What else do we have in the chat here? So I'm going to add hurt and disappointment. As Michelle mentioned that. Vulnerable, yes. Thank you so much for mentioning that, Anna. Vulnerability is really terrifying for a lot of folks who have experienced trauma. And I imagine, now I don't know all of you very personally, but I imagine that many of us who are helping professionals do it because we are helpers in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives, right? And so a lot of us get brought to this field because we have a natural ability to nurture, a natural ability to help others, right? We're drawn to social services. Y'all are so smart. You could have any job you wanted, I have no doubt, but you choose to work with kids and families and clients, right? In a way that others don't choose. And so when we are always the strong one, or when we are always the person taking care of other people, if we have a profound loss, that can feel very vulnerable because all of a sudden we're the ones who need help, but we don't always ask for help, or we're the ones who are struggling and we don't really know how to be vulnerable in front of other people. And so that's not the case for everybody, but I have a feeling it's the case for some of us. And so I just wanted to mention that. Let's see, denial. Yes, denial is a really important one. So denial, what is denial? Like how would y'all describe that? What is denial? Withdrawn, uninvited. Ooh, uninvited. Wow.
Disbelief.
Disbelief, right? Okay. I tried to keep up with the chat while you all were thinking. Thank you for that. So denial is this idea of disbelief, right? And so when I think of denial, I think about people who are trying to survive, right? And so in our grief groups, we have a ritual called thumb ball, and everybody in the grief group takes a turn every single group saying their name, how they're feeling right now. They answer like a fun fact on a ball, and then they share who's died in their lives. And every once in a while, we have a kid who says, "No one's died in my life." Now, I know for a fact that someone has died because some adult signed that child up for grief group and there has been a death. But it is not really my job, particularly as a therapeutic support, it is not really my job to rip denial away from someone if that is what they need in the moment to survive. Most denial does not last forever. And so if I have a client who says, like, I just have to kind of pretend he's on vacation right now because I can't really deal with it. I have to just get through this season. I have to get through this, the end of the school year or the holidays or whatever it is, and then I'll deal with it and then it will hit me, right? It makes sense, right? So a lot of denial can be adaptive. I think one of the things that can be sort of like a trap is that when we are supporting grieving people, the reality of life without that person or those people who have died can be so large and so overwhelming that it actually can be helpful for those people who are grieving them to take the grief in pieces, right? To take it in bite-sized pieces. Kids do this. Actually, all of their grief experience is kind of in bite-sized pieces. That's why kids have the ability to melt down and have these huge emotive wailing moments. And then 5 minutes later, they're like play fighting with their cousin as though it never happened, right? And it can be startling for us as adults because we're like, how did you transition from that to that so abruptly? But that's exactly how kids grieve. They're going to bite off grief. They're going to be really immersed in it, and then they're going to spit it right out, and they're going to come back to it when they can because they don't have the ability to integrate the same way we do. But most trauma cannot be integrated immediately, right? Most trauma, most loss, we take pieces of it and we move through it as we need to. And so when denial comes up, as long as someone is safe, it's not always our job to rip that denial away from them. Usually, time moves that denial through. And again, when people are in survival mode, as long as they're not hurting themselves or others, I want them to survive. Survival gets very creative when it has to. And so, thank you for mentioning denial. Let's see. Lack of acceptance, thinking that never happened. Yes. Inability to process or purposefully evading a probable true reality. Yeah, definitely. So I also appreciated that you all mentioned like the lack of acceptance or thinking that it never happened, this idea of like it feeling sort of surreal. That is usually a result of shock, right? And so I'm going to add shock too. And so when we think about shock, we know that our brains are very sophisticated. Our brains are doing an enormous amount of things, even right now, while we're sitting here having this conversation, to keep us alive. And so when something feels too overwhelming or too scary, when something goes from just stress, so stress is something we all have, right? But when something kind of escalates from being stressful to being traumatic, it escalates because it is more than we can cope with. Our coping skills are overwhelmed. We cannot cope with it. And so what our brains do is it actually starts to put the emotional impact of whatever we're going through in a different part of our brain. Usually that's our amygdala. And it really allows us to kind of just withdraw emotion from it. And so I don't know if any of you have all been to like a homegoing or a janaza or a funeral where like you want to cry and you feel like you should be crying or should be emoting in a way that feels natural to you, but you just kind of feel numb and it doesn't feel real and you kind of feel dissociated from your body. That's trauma, right? Like that's traumatic grief. That's what our brains and bodies do to protect us because it's too much, right? And so then we're going to pull out the grief in small pockets when we feel safe enough to. But that idea of surreal and did this really happen? And I can't believe that it happened. It's very, very normal. And that can last many weeks, depending on the relationship. Um, so let's talk about, before we discuss taking a break or not, let's talk about a feeling that starts with a G. I think someone may have mentioned it for a moment earlier, but what is a feeling that clients, kids, families may feel in their grief? It's not the word grief, but that they may feel in their grief. Guilt.
Guilt.
Thank you, Hayden. Thank you, Aubrey. Yes, guilt. Why do you think people might feel guilty after a really significant loss?
You always feel like there's more to say.
Hmm.
You could have done more. You could have done something
Hmm.
to prevent their departure.
Hmm.
Straight down that hallway, and you turn left to the end of the hall. Sorry, I'm still at work.
No problem. I know y'all are multitasking. Mr. Fraser, thank you so much for that. So sometimes it feels like there's always something we could have done. Maybe that's something that we didn't get to say or an experience we didn't get to have with that person, or maybe it's something that we regret doing now that they're no longer here. Or maybe we are feeling like, oh, if I had just told them to come over that night instead of going there, if I had just told them to go to the doctor 3 years ago, right? If I had just. And that is also what we have to recognize is that is also our brains deep desire to have some kind of control of the situation, right? Because this is an unjust, unfair, uncontrollable, horrific tragedy that we're going through, right? Grief is this huge thing that's changed us. And our brains, just like kids, are going to want to feel some level of control with it. And so, a way that our brain tries to trick us, because this is what trauma does, right? It's not always logical. It tries to say, like, well, if I had only done this, or if I had known this, right? But a lot of times people didn't die because of things we did or didn't do, right? That's the reality, that's the logic, that's the truth. But our brains, our prefrontal cortex is up here. This is where logic lives. But when we're grieving and when we're in acute trauma and stress, a lot of times we are activating other parts of our brains that are not as logical because they're moving through things emotionally, right? And so that's a little less logical. And a lot of times we might use very vivid imaginations, just like kids may, and we might try to be coming up with ways that we could have been in more power so that we could have stopped it, even if we could not have objectively, right? And so let's see, in the chat, we have an unresolved conflict with the person. Yep. Things left unsaid or unacknowledged. Absolutely. Remembering times they might have said no to plans with that person, remembering times of conflict with that person or things you said to them. Yes, absolutely. And the I should haves. Yes, absolutely. So these are all very real. When clients are grieving, and they don't really know where to go, right? Especially in those first few weeks, those first few days. Sometimes they will want a safe person just to unleash their guilt and regret on, right? They might just want someone to sit with that. And when that happens, they are giving us a gift because guilt is a very shameful thing to talk about for some families. Sometimes our shame and our vulnerability sit right next to each other, and so it's very difficult for some people to open up about that stuff. And so, again, I'm going to emphasize two things. If we are ever in the role of supporting, especially a family with kids who are going through something like this, if they've had a profound death, we always, always, always want to tell them that it was not their fault, right? Especially kids. If you have a grieving child in any of your families or in anywhere in your world, please, please tell them it was not their fault. Now, here's the thing about that. Not every kid is going to worry that it was their fault, but most are, even kids who don't say it. That's the thing. A lot of kids censor themselves and they are trying to kind of take care of the adults in their life to try to protect us from their own feelings. So we actually, there are many more kids who are feeling responsible for a person's death than we even know. And so we always want to say it wasn't your fault. And we have to understand so it's kind of like a two-pronged approach. We have to also understand that us saying that is not going to magically make guilt disappear, right? For some people, guilt is a huge part of their grief journeys, and they have to get to know that guilt. They have to be the ones to challenge that guilt. They have to be the ones to kind of move through it and move around it and figure out how and where and when this does or doesn't make sense. But what we have to do is we have to say it wasn't your fault because the more we say it and the more people say it to a child, the more they will work through that. But also, we can't have an unrealistic expectation that that's going to make their guilt go away, right? And so we have to be able to carry both. It's not your fault. And I understand that you're feeling that way, and I'll hold that with you, right? Like I get it. I felt like that too. And so we have to be sure that we're doing both of those things. We don't just want to be like, oh, I can understand why you're feeling that way, and then not tell them it wasn't their fault, because especially kids are going to go to, oh, well, if they didn't say it, then of course it was my fault. But we also can't assume that that guilt's going to, disappear in an instant just because we told them it wasn't their fault. All right, y'all, we're going to talk about one more feeling and then we're going to discuss a break. This feeling starts with an R and then an E. And it is not going to be true for everybody. I want to make that very clear, but it is going to be true for some folks. Regret, Alex, I appreciate that. That's not the one I was thinking of, but you saying that made me realize it's not on the list yet. So regret is there. Relief. Thank you, Adina. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Relief. So let's talk about relief. It is not going to be true for everybody, and that's okay. But for those people who it is true for, why might they feel relief in their grief?
Can you say that one more time?
Why might Absolutely, Sarah. Thanks for asking. Why might some people feel relief in their grief? And it's not going to be true for everybody. Okay, so in the chat we have no more suffering. Yes, exactly. The person is no longer in pain, no more pain. Yes. And so, especially for folks who had an injury or an illness, or were in a lot of pain or were suffering before they died, there can be relief that we experience of, I'm just so glad that they're not in that pain. They're not suffering anymore. And even kids can experience that, right? They can know what that means. And Christine, I'm really glad you mentioned this. Caregiving, especially for loved ones who have a lot of high needs, is a lot of work, right? And so so my grandmother lived with us until she was like 92 years old, and it was a huge part of my life taking care of her. And I never wanted her to die. I never wanted her to die. I wanted her to live forever and be the one person on earth who lived forever. And at the same time, I did feel relieved when my constant day was not revolving around her care, right? It doesn't mean I wasn't devastated. It doesn't mean I didn't grieve very deeply. It doesn't mean she's not still a huge part of me. It just means that I could acknowledge the truth that my days were, while emotionally more complicated, were logistically a little simpler, if that makes sense. And so grief does not necessarily discriminate. You can feel relieved and still be having all those other normal feelings. But I think for some folks, they might not know that they're allowed to feel relieved. Then they might feel really guilty and really ashamed of those feelings. And so if someone, again, was in a caregiving role, it can be helpful for us to remind them, it's okay to feel relieved that this part of the work is over. It doesn't mean you're bad. It doesn't mean you're not missing them. It doesn't mean you wouldn't give anything for them to be here with you. It just means that caregiving is a lot of work, right? That's all that that means. And then the other reason for that, and Jake, you put it in the chat, if a family member who died who was an abuser, right? And so that does happen. We know that that's a reality. So we never want to jump to the assumption that someone had a positive relationship with who died. We always want to ask instead of assume. Like, what was your relationship like? Instead of assume, oh, you must miss them so much. Not everybody misses everybody who dies. That being said, that is still going to be a loss experience, right? I always think about like the more complicated the relationship, the more complicated the grief, right? And so there is still going to be a grief experience. That loss is still going to be real. And there might also be relief of, yeah, I'm safer now, or yeah, my life is a lot less stressful, or wow, I feel peace at home in a way I didn't get to before. But even if those feelings are very prevalent, there is still going to be a loss associated with that because that grief is going to look different and it's going to be more complex. And it's not just going to be like an instantaneous, like, oh yeah, everything's fixed now. Like there is still going to be a huge roller coaster of grief with that. And a resolution of roller coaster uncertainty. Yes, absolutely. So if I'll say this to all of you because you'll understand this. Sometimes when I say it without context, people don't get it. But like if you are constantly waiting by the phone and you're worried that every phone call is the phone call, right? Whether someone is struggling with substance use or someone is struggling with mental health or someone is struggling with their physical health or they're very sick. Sometimes we worry that every call is the call, right? And so we have to get ourselves braced every time the phone rings. And there is something to be said, to your point, Anna, about the idea that someone is safely dead, right? It has happened. We don't have the anguish and the anticipation of waiting for it that we used to. And so there can be relief of that anguish and the anticipation being done. Again, that's not going to be true for everybody, but it is going to be true for some of our clients. And we want to make sure that we can hold and receive that just as much as we can hold and receive all their other grief experiences. All right, Shaw, you have done an amazing job. Thank you so much for all of your insightful comments. I do want to check in. It's 3:15, 3:14. Do we want a 5-minute break or do we want to move forward? I saw one vote earlier from Vanessa that Vanessa wanted a break. How do others feel? Same. Okay, so Claudine feels the same. So it's 2 votes for a break.
I'm down with getting it all done, but you guys, I'll do whatever you guys all want to.
Okay. Let's see. 2, 1. Okay, I'm trying to count. It looks like we're here until 2 o'clock to answer your question, Michelle. We're here until 2 o'clock. Oh my gosh, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock. We're here till 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, Marquita. My day's been a little wild. Okay, so it looks like we have a mix, but the five, I think the 5 is winning. So let's do the 5. It was almost a tie. Let's do the 5 minutes. We're gonna come back at 3:20, and we're gonna start right again at 3:20. So if you are back, you do not have to turn your screen on, but just please do come back. And then we'll go from 3:20 to 4 o'clock, and we will still make sure to definitely finish on time. We won't keep anybody beyond 4. All right. Thanks for voting, y'all. I will see you at 3:20. And Marquita and I are going to be here. I'll turn my screen off, but if you need something or you want to chat about something, just holler, and we'll come back on. Thanks, y'all. Thank you, Anna. All right, y'all. Welcome back. It is 3:20. We have 40 more minutes together. I am grateful for all of your presence and engagement. And as promised, we are going to keep moving forward so that way we get you all out of here on time. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again. Thanks for the thumbs up, Miss Renita. I appreciate that. All right. So we have talked about this already, but grief is different and unique for every single one of us. And something that I did not know before I started doing grief work was that there's actually no therapeutic merit in comparing one kid's grief to another person's grief or comparing one adult's grief to another adult's grief. When I was much younger in my work, I really absorbed this idea of like conformity and people needing to do something at a baseline that was consistent across all other humans. And that is not how a lot of this works, right? And so it's really important. Like if we have clients who are like, oh my gosh, like, I just keep struggling with this part of my grief and I don't understand. Everybody else seems to be doing this part just fine. It's our job in those moments to really hold that with tenderness and with care and to say, like, there's no wrong way to do it. There's no wrong way to grieve. A lot of people like me were not taught that, right? And so that can be a really golden moment for us to hold that and to provide this deep level of validation of whatever the client's grief looks like in front of us. I also just really love this image. It's kind of what I talked about before of, our society really wants grief to be this linear journey. Grief is so not linear. Most big journeys in our life are not, right? And it's also not one of those things where we can accurately always predict when it's going to get easier, when it's going to change. It is just often going to be kind of a jumble of a roller coaster. So now I'm going to ask you all, how long do you think grief lasts? I think we've talked about this maybe a little bit, but not too much.
A lifetime.
A lifetime. Thank you, Aubrey. Why is that? Why is grief not something that just goes away?
Because it takes time to heal.
That's right. Thank you so much for that, Marion. It takes time, right? Was there somebody else?
Yeah, some
Go ahead.
grief takes years, some take a lifetime. Like for me, since I lost my mom, I have not got over it yet, and I don't think I'm gonna get over it because it just comes like a flash. When it takes years, months, weeks, it just gets new to me. So I just believe that some grief don't go away; it stay with you forever.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. Grief stays with us forever. Grief stays with us forever. Absolutely. Thank you all so much for that. And see, in the chat, it says it depends on the person. That is certainly true. It definitely depends on the person. Zero time limit on healing, no time frame, and forever, right? And so a lot of our society does not know this, right? And I'm not even going to say people don't know this. I think it's one of those things where we just have a lot of barriers, like societal barriers around understanding that grief lasts forever, right? And so it's so important that we help our clients see too that we don't expect them to feel better anytime soon. What happens to a lot of grieving people, and those of us who are grieving, we may know this firsthand, is that other people become so uncomfortable, like we said earlier, with our grief that they start to become uncomfortable with us as grieving people. And so we might start, or our clients might start to censor our grief, right? Or to swallow some of it, or to pretend that it's not there. And we have this opportunity as helpers, as helping professionals, to be people and receivers and containers for clients who are grieving, where you don't have to convince me that you're feeling better. I can receive you in any form or shape, right? If you're not doing well, that's okay with me. I mean, I want you to be doing well, but I also know that nothing is going to feel good right now, right? And we can honor that. And we can just kind of sit in however much that's awful together, right? You don't have to sit there by yourself. I'll sit there with you. And so I think for a lot of us, it can be hard to not only be honest about our grief, but also to find people who can receive it kind of without that filter. And so that's one of the cool things about being in the roles that we're in. We get to receive that grief from other people and we get to give them permission for it to be awful, right? A lot of times that's what's going to be most healing. We also know that grief doesn't necessarily end, but sometimes it does change as we grow and change, right? And so for those of us who have been on a grief journey for many years, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we know that that grief is going to evolve, right? We are constantly changing and evolving. That's one of the really cool parts of being human. I know my grief feels different than it did 10 years ago. It doesn't necessarily mean it's larger or smaller. It just means that it's kind of different. It's evolved the way I have grown. And there is let me find this image. There's this image here that I really love. And so if you are able to look at the screen, I encourage you to do so. But it says, people think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. And so we talked about that a little earlier, about this idea of what does it mean when grief is not the only part of our life, but we can be expansive and have other parts of our life too. We can try new things, we can connect with others, we can find and experience joy. It doesn't mean our grief is going anywhere, but a lot of times someone or our clients or us might feel guilty about that because our grief is what connects us to our people, right? The people who are so sacred to us and who are so important to us that we'll carry them forever. And that's the reality. And I think, again, grieving people really benefit from hearing that from us, especially as helpers, to hear there's nothing you could do that would travel farther, that would travel so far that you still wouldn't be connected to your person, right? You can go to Japan, you can go to Australia, you can join the circus. Your person is still a part of you, right? There's nowhere you could go and nothing you could do that would not tie you to them because that is how connected you are and that is how sacred that bond is. And so that can be an encouraging thing for us to share with folks who are in that part of grief of the, oh, but I want to be doing other things and I'm feeling guilty about allowing other things to come into my life along with the grief. All right. I'm now going to ask for a volunteer to read something because I think it's a really powerful quote, and I'm going to give you a second to work your courage up to read this out loud for us because I'm going to share with you the book that it's from. So this book, the cover is right here on the screen. It's called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay: Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand." And the author is Megan Devine. And so Megan Devine she's got a lot of great grief stuff out there. She has a website. She has a lot of different I think she's written another book. I think she also has a journal, like a guided journal. But she does a lot of research and a lot of work with grieving folks. Her specialty is not kids. And so at Uplift, we use her a little bit with our caregivers, but we don't use her a ton because her work is not based in child development. That being said, there is a quote here. It's an excerpt from her book that I would love a volunteer to unmute and read out loud for us. So whenever you're ready, someone can unmute and start to read, or you can put your hand up. You can write in the chat that you're willing to volunteer.
Okay. Hey, wait. It's okay that you're not okay. Meeting grief and loss in a society that doesn't understand. The reality of grief is far different from what others see from the outside. There is pain in this world that you can't be cheered out of. You don't need solutions. You don't need to move on from your grief. You need someone to see your grief and acknowledge it. You need someone to hold your hand while you stand in the blinking horror, start staring at the hole that was your life. Some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fraser. I appreciate you reading that for us. So I am going to ask, thank you. I'm going to ask if there's any reactions to that quote before we move forward. How does it land?
Can I say that sometimes it can be carried to another stage in your grief because one might get emotional and then the next month they may feel suicidal. The next month they feel as though that they can't make it without that person, or they want someone to feel how they feel. And I love this right here for the simple fact that I went through this before and I learned from this lesson because the more I said to them, the more they hurt and the more they lashed out at me. So it was an experience that I experienced to be quiet and just acknowledge it and hold their hand. So that was a really difficult moment in my life to go through that with somebody that was close to me that had lost a child. So it is best sometimes just to be quiet and to hold their hand because it seemed like it made things worse.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Miss Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your reflections on that. I really appreciated what you said about sometimes when people are grieving, they want you to feel what they feel, right? And I think that there's so much power in feeling not alone in our feelings. And even if, like for our clients, we might not have known the person who died in their lives, right? Like they might be grieving this very profound person to them that we didn't get to meet. And so we might not be feeling their exact grief over that exact person. But if we are empathic, and if I love what you said about just kind of receiving in a still way, right? Like whatever they have to offer, just kind of sitting in that with them, because it ends up being so validating, right? And I think what happens a lot with grief is that it gets shoved away or it gets suppressed or somebody puts pressure on you to feel better. Why aren't you feeling better about that? You're still going on about that. It's been 6 months, it's been 6 years. You're still going on about that. There's so much pressure in this world for that to not be what it is, right? And so when we are able to provide like a genuinely non-judgmental space, that can be more healing, right? And at first it can feel like, oh gosh, am I making this worse? Is this not helping because it's they're emoting and expressing so much? But in reality, that's what grief needs, right? It needs to get out. It needs to be seen, like the quote says, it needs to be expressed. And that's something we can do. That's something we can receive. And I think for some of us, again, people who are fixers and problem solvers and those who are always everybody's kind of like rock of stability. I know like I am somebody who absolutely used to do this where I was like, "Oh, but I want them to feel better. And so I'm going to empower them to feel better." And I hadn't done grief work yet, and so I didn't understand that that was actually counterintuitive. I really wanted them to feel less pain. I didn't understand that my desire for someone to feel less pain was rooted in a dismissal of their pain, right? I didn't know that yet. I hadn't evolved that much as a practitioner, as a clinician. And now that I understand it, I think the ways that we are raised to kind of fix or cheer up can sometimes be counterintuitive to how we support real grief with real people. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts on that? All right, y'all. You are doing great. I so appreciate it. There's a lot more slides that I skipped for now, just for the sake of time, but you will get all of the slides. I'll send them to Hayden, and Hayden will send them out. And so you'll have access to them. And for our last 25 minutes or so, we're going to talk about coping and we're going to talk about continuing bonds. And so my next question to you all is, what is coping? What does it mean to cope? And that could be with grief or with anything, but like, what does it mean to cope? What does it mean to cope? Thanks, Hayden. Manage tasks of daily living. Yep, yep. Oh, I can. Now they're coming into the chat. How you deal with a situation. Yes, exactly. The use of anything to get through from day to day. Yes, yes. And to just be. Oh, I love that. Yes. And so I really appreciate, let's see, Vanessa wrote acknowledgement, ways of dealing with loss. Yes, exactly. So you all have a sort of a shared thread in what you said about what coping is or what coping means, right? And I see the word dealing with loss. I see the use of something to get through the day. I see how dealing with it or managing, right? That's what coping is. It's managing or dealing with what's already there. What I often have to say, especially when working with kids, is that a coping tool does not make a feeling magically go away. Because what did we talk about earlier? Feelings are an essential part of being human, right? Just like they're all normal, they are all here to tell us something, right? They're here as pieces of information. And so coping tools are things that we can use to manage our feelings. They're things that we can use to handle our feelings. I have on the screen that a coping tool can give us a place to put our feelings or to get our feelings out. And they can make our experiences feel more manageable and less scary, but they are not going to make something magically go away. And so with clients, I always remind them like, what are you doing to manage this? I always want them to know, and so I say it very clearly and directly. That doesn't mean I expect this to feel good, right? I'm never going to expect this to feel good. But what are you doing so that way things feel a little more manageable? Or like what's helping you zone out? What's helping you rest? What's helping you get this off of your chest? Like what coping tools are you using? And I think sometimes we have clients who are already doing a lot of different things to cope, but they might not always recognize them as a coping tool. And so that can be really empowering for us to have that conversation as well. And so I always think about a few things when we think about coping, right? So I think when we think about coping, a lot of times, again, we live in a society that has kind of commodified self-care in a way. And so sometimes when I think about coping or I think about self-care, I think about what like social media tells us that it is, and that's face masks and going to the spa. And while those things can be lovely, right, like we said earlier, we do have accessible coping skills. And those are tools that we could use anytime, no matter where we are, whether it's something that we can do in our body, whether it's something we say to ourselves, like an affirmation or a mantra that we might repeat to ourselves, whether it is something physical that we use, whether it's like just the way that we position our body or putting weight or putting tactile or sensory pressure on a part of our body to get that relief, or whether it's really being in touch with our breath and where does our breath live? Is it shallow and in our chest? Are we pushing it down into our belly? Are we moving our body? Are we getting fresh oxygen to our limbs? All of those things, right? And so I think about a couple of things with coping. I think many of us have heard of the type of coping skills that kind of de-escalate and calm us, right? And so what is an example of a calming coping tool that helps us kind of like get grounded and get centered? It's an example of a calming coping tool. Meditation, yep. Gardening, breathing, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, just like we said about grief, there are going to be coping tools on here where you're like, oh, that would never work for me. And that's totally fine. Coping is going to be very unique and individual. And so just because it works really well for someone, it doesn't have to work really well for you. Listening to music, yes, music can be really powerful. There's a lot of research around how our bodies actually attune to the BPM, beats per minute, in music. And so if you are trying to kind of calm yourself and get grounded, a lot of us listen to music that's slower. If you go on YouTube, you can find like 60 BPM playlists. And we also listen to faster music usually if we're like working out or trying to get ourselves pumped up for something, right? Our bodies kind of naturally attune to the rhythm in the air. Let's see. Gardening, breathing, listening to music, dancing. Oh, I love dancing. Thank you for that. Building resilience through working out. Claudine and Renita, you both said dancing at the same time. Hopefully you all get to dance together sometimes. That would be fun. Walking, yes, definitely. So walking, I'm glad that you mentioned that because walking is an example of something called bilateral stimulation. And so bilateral stimulation is a big part of EMDR therapy, but it's also something that we just do in our daily lives, right? Yes, it's part of EMDR therapy, but we do use it every single day. So anything that uses both hemispheres of our brain can be soothing, right? It can help us settle, it can help us ground. So walking, because we're using both sides of our bodies, that can be bilateral stimulation. With kids, I often teach them a butterfly tap. Hopefully you can see my shirt here. So I'll put my arms on opposite shoulders and I'll just kind of tap out a rhythm on my hands. This is also bilateral stimulation. And if kids are little, sometimes they like doing this because you can look like a butterfly with your fingers. But if you have older kids who are going to be embarrassed doing that, they can do it on their lap. They can tap back and forth. Any kind of rhythmic back and forth, whether it's walking, whether it's moving, whether it's tapping, even if it's running or playing a sport, that can be really grounding, right? And so we have a lot of different tools that we might use to kind of calm ourselves. We also know with grief, sometimes we need tools that don't just calm, but that actually help us express, right? Express and emote and metabolize and get feelings out of our body, out of our chest, out of our shoulders, right? And so, Michelle, you mentioned writing. Writing, I think that can be huge. I was working with a kid a couple of months ago who mentioned that they really loved to write, but they just didn't feel like they had privacy because they were worried that if they wrote something in a journal, then someone would find it and they would, just not have the privacy for it. And so I said, well, what if we wrote it and then you destroyed it, like, and you kind of like ripped it up? And that actually became a really cathartic coping tool for this kiddo because they could write all the things they wanted to. They could use curse words, they could swear, they could say unfair things, and then they would just destroy it into all these little pieces. and we would throw it away at a trash can, somewhere that couldn't be put back together because I think it was a trash can at school. And so even if it's writing that we want to keep and kind of use it as a form of narrative therapy for ourselves, that's beautiful. If it's writing where we're like, no, I don't ever want to see this again, I want it destroyed, we can destroy it, right? I've sometimes people will burn things as a way of like a really deep healing and releasing. However you need to do with your writing and your work, and any forms of art, I think that can be a huge form of embodiment and of expression, right? Dancing can also be one of those things that helps us cope, but gets the feelings out of our body, right? And so it's one thing to kind of calm. We need both of these, but we also have to do things that get things out, get things expressed, right? So that's dancing or playing an instrument or running or playing a sport, right? A lot of our kids and families might use sports or any type of exercise to cope. We know that also there's like a physical release to that. And so I was not convinced of this personal impact on me for a long time because I'm not an exercise person by nature. But my husband was always like, no, no, like my body feels calmer after I run because I run really fast and like it's just like the intensity of it and then there's like a kind of a release after. And I was like, that's not going to be true for me. But I think I just needed to find exercise that worked for me, right? I'm not a runner, but we can always kind of modify something and find something that works for us. And so when I found my own source of exercise, it almost gives that same intensity of feeling inside you. Like it can sometimes mirror anxiety when we're exercising. It can mirror our body's response to anxiety, but we get to control it, right? We get to decide when it starts and goes. And so it actually can be really healing in that way. Praying, Miss Vanessa, thank you for mentioning that. And so, for those of us who have a faith background, I know faith is not everybody's thing, but for those of us who do have a faith background, I think thinking through how faith and our grief interact and coexist can be a really powerful thing, right? So, sometimes for grieving folks, sometimes their faith can be a huge source of support and of encouragement and of strength. And for others, I know like we have some kids who are like, well, I'm mad at my God, right? Like, how did they allow this to happen? And so faith is something that for those of us who have it, it's such a crucial and integral part of ourselves that we want to figure out how does faith play in with my grief? And I think when we have clients who we know they have a really strong faith background and then they have a loss, we might see that come up with them, right? They might reference their faith, they might talk about praying, and we might encourage them to get support from a spiritual community if that's useful to them as well. All right. Any other thoughts on coping? Y'all are doing great. We've got about 15 minutes left. Any other thoughts on coping? All right. All right. So the other part of coping in our grief, and this is something that you can do with your clients or encourage your clients to do, is finding ways to memorialize who and what we have lost. And so, like we talked about before, our society has a huge stigma with grief. And I think a lot of times the message, the harmful message that we might get might be, well, you have to move on, right? You have to like move on and move past it. But we don't actually move on from grief. We've talked about this, right? We don't move on from grief. And so clinically and therapeutically, the goal of doing grief work or grief therapy with anybody is not to get any client to overcome their grief. That's never the therapeutic goal. The therapeutic goal is really how do we integrate that grief into someone's schema of understanding of their self-identity, right? So like I said before, my name is Catherine, and my grief is a part of me, but it's not all of me. That's the goal of a lot of grief therapy, right? Our goal is not to get someone to overcome it or to move past it or to forget about it. And so that's going to be the same thing when we think about the people who we've lost, right? And so these people who are so profound and so sacred to us and are part of who we are and we carry them with us forever, not only should we stay connected to them, but it's actually a really necessary part of grief. We should not forget about them. We should kind of take them into our bodies and into our souls and really understand that we get to carry them with us in whatever way makes sense for us. And so I'm going to ask you all another question. How do we stay connected to the people that we've lost? How might we do it? How might our clients do it? How does that connection stay present after someone has died? Let's see. In the chat, we have memories. Yes, memories are a huge one, right? Now, some of our clients might have more memories than others, right? Especially our kids. Sometimes someone dies when a child is like 4 or 5, and so it might be they might not have as many memories of them. But whatever memories they do have, like talking about those and kind of keeping those alive, absolutely. Talking to them, yes, yes. I think that's one of the great things about doing like supporting grieving folks. Mr. Nita, you mentioned talking to them, is it is not often complicated, right? We can just say, wow, like can you tell, like, if you're ever comfortable sharing a story about them, I would really love to hear it, right? Someone in my life just had a really profound loss, and it's of someone who I hadn't really heard about them mentioned. I knew the players in this person's life, but I didn't know about this person who died. And so I was like, I would really just love to learn about them. And allowing space for someone to talk about their person who has died is one of the biggest gifts we could give, right? Even if it's 5 minutes, but our kind of undivided, focused attention receiving and wanting to know about them is huge, right? Because I've heard this from our families a lot. Like, just because someone has died doesn't mean our relationship with them has died, right? And so, as helpers, we can help to nurture that enduring bond. Let's see, looking at old photos and videos, yes, absolutely. And I will say about that, people are going to have different kind of like different needs when it comes to looking at old photos and videos. Some people are going to have a ton of them and they're just not going to be ready to watch any of them for a long time, and that's okay, right? Others are going to eat them all up, right? They're going to want to watch it all the time. They're going to want to put photos everywhere in their home, everywhere in their world. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just that for some folks, watching a video or looking at a photo might feel too painful and too overwhelming at first or for a little while, and that's okay too. Family altars and memorials. Yes, yes, absolutely. Some folks make these really, really special and beautiful with candles and framed photos, and that's all amazing. We can also help our clients make memorials and altars that are very small, right? Even if it's just like one little corner of one little place in their home. A memorial does not need to be fancy. It could just be a photo, or it could be something that reminds them of that. I have a little I always associate tissue packs, like the little individual tissue packs, with my grandmother, the one I mentioned earlier. And so I just always keep one of those tissue packs around. It's nothing fancy. It's not on a memorial. But just having them around makes me feel comforted. It makes me feel like she's close by. And so that's kind of like my like unconventional memorial, if you will, right? It's just something that's comforting. I don't need it to be up on a mantle. I don't even have a mantle. But there's all these different types of ways that we can create that. Let's see, keeping traditions and eating special foods. Yes, I love that. We talked about traditions earlier. Encouraging clients to think through how they want to handle certain traditions can be very helpful. And so, especially if there are kids in the family, kids are often very set on traditions, right? Because they're creatures of habit, they like consistency. And so, thinking about, do any traditions need to change? Do you want to keep the traditions? And how can we kind of prepare others for, this is the same thing we've always done. It is going to feel different this time, right? Because there's someone who's supposed to be here who's not here. And so we're going to get through this together, right? We're going to talk about that person throughout it. I think that's one of the most healing things when we're working with grieving folks is like even casual questions like, oh my gosh, like that casserole that you made, like it looks so good. Like, now would your pop have liked that casserole or would he not have been for it, right? Like even just these small questions we can ask to kind of keep that person's memory alive with our clients, that can be really powerful. Doing things that they used to do. Yes, yes, absolutely. There's so much legacy in that, right? Whether it's things like a location, so we call in grief work, we call certain things linking objects or linking places. And so whether it's going to a place that they really loved, or like eating special food on their birthday or their anniversary, or even just, I had a family once who the person who died was really into magic tricks. Like it was their grandfather and he just loved doing magic tricks. And so the mom was like, you know what? I'm just going to learn how to do this. And she I think she like tried to learn some things online. And at the end of the day, she was like, it's not really for me, but I love that I tried. I love that I got to be kind of connected to this thing. And she was like, I'm always going to have a special place in my heart for that because it was his, right? But so it's part of me, but I'm not necessarily going to be good at the actual magic trick part. And so that's the thing. There's really no wrong way to do any of that. Talk about them sharing memories with families and friends. Yes, absolutely. And so when we are, and I know I've said this before, but it's so important. When we are working with grieving clients, we want to be asking about how their grief is. We want to be asking about that person. We want to be saying, you really can talk to me if you want to. You don't have to, but like it's an open invite. You don't have to wait for me to ask, right? You can just say like, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? Um, and we want to be asking about their people, right? And about what their people would be thinking about this going on or this going on, right? And so those are all some really, really beautiful ideas. I have a couple of more on the screen here. So memory boxes, that's something that you can encourage any family you work with to make. I find that it's especially helpful for kids because they can create, and it could be a box of anything, right? It could be an Amazon box, it could be any box. They can color it, they can decorate it. And then what's really special about a memory box is they can put all of their special things inside the memory box. And so anything that reminds them of their person has this kind of like sacred holding spot. And that way it keeps them really safe and really protected. And when we are thinking about like those items that we might have, like some of us might have jewelry or clothing, or photos from our people who have died. We also want to honor and remember that not everybody is going to have jewelry, photos, or clothing from the person who died. Maybe they didn't live with them, or maybe they just didn't get access to them. Or especially for kids, maybe they have moved foster homes so many times they don't have a lot of those linking objects, those traditional linking objects. And so I always love to remind people that anything could be a linking object. Anything can remind us of our people and our special people who have died if we're creative enough, right? And so my grandmother's favorite color was purple. I don't own any of her purple clothes. I think she only even had like maybe one shirt that was purple, but I do have access to a purple marker. Or when I see something purple, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of her, right? Anything, if we think outside the box, can be a linking object, can help us stay connected. We've already talked about altars. We also know that a lot of folks make memorial hoodies, memorial t-shirts, clothes, necklaces. And for those of us who work with clients, I do want to emphasize if someone is wearing a memorial t-shirt or a memorial hoodie and it has a photo of someone who's died on it, they are usually wearing that so that it can be seen. And so they're kind of handing us this golden opportunity on a platter for us to see their grief. And so whenever I see someone with a t-shirt that has a photo of someone or it says rest in peace or something about angels getting wings, I usually do say something, but I always am careful to phrase it in a way that doesn't add pressure to them that they have to start talking about it, but they're wearing it because they want it to be seen, right? They're wearing it because they want their person to be seen. And so I usually just say like, oh my gosh, wow, I love that photo. Like that's a really special photo on there. And that gives them all the agency and choice and control in the world, right? Because they could say like, oh my God, thank you. This is my cousin, da 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 da. Let me tell you about her. Or they can just say, oh, thank you. And that can be done, right? Like I'm not asking a question that requires a response. I'm just seeing it. I'm just seeing their person. I'm seeing their grief because that's why they're wearing it. They're wearing it because they want it to be seen. We also know that folks might get tattoos. If we had time, I would ask you all about any special tattoos you've seen. I know they're not everybody's thing, but for those of us who do have them, that can be a really powerful way of memorializing someone. We also, like I said, I love talking about accessible coping tools. Something that we don't spend enough time talking about is self-talk, right? Wherever we are, we can talk to ourselves. Usually it's internal, but if we're alone, sure, why not? We can make it external, right? But the other thing that we have to remember is that we always have the ability to talk to the people who have died in our heads, right? Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we can talk to them in our heads. And so I think that that's something that I really like to remind people they can do. They can keep that conversation going. That idea of continuing the relationship after someone has died is so, so important. I had an intern once who had a regular journal for like her day-to-day life, and then she had a mom journal, and that journal was really just filled with messages to her mom about all the things that was happening in her life that she hadn't gotten to tell her. And I just thought that was really powerful. We've already talked about like anniversary rituals on their birthday. The thing about anniversaries is that there's no, like with everything with grief, there's no right or wrong way to do it. And so some families are going to say like, no, I'm going to pull the curtains closed. I'm not getting out of bed that day. I just need to survive it. While others are going to want to do a balloon release or go out to eat or gather with their community. Again, there's no wrong way to do it. It is helpful if we know an anniversary is coming up to ask a family, what are your plans for it, right? Because anticipating it and having a plan, even if it's staying in the bed the whole day, that can again help it feel more manageable. And then incorporating their memory into milestones. So we just had like end of the school year, graduation season, prom season. For kids who are graduating from eighth grade or from high school or from college, I think it can be really powerful to remind them and ask them how would they like their person who died to be honored in that day, because it's a really big day and someone is supposed to be there who's not there. And so whether that's like them all in their graduation regalia holding up a photo of that person who's died and then a photo being taken of them together, right? I think things as small as that can be really powerful and can kind of create space for their memory on a day like that. And then the last thing I'm going to share, and this is really only for adults, maybe some teens, but mostly for adults, is writing them letters. And so actually kids of all ages can do this. They can write them letters, they can write them messages. But something else that I encourage adults, this is more abstract, so it's really only for adults, is writing a message from that person to you. And so, like, really, the idea of imagining the reciprocation of the other side of the conversation, right? So, like, if someone says to you, like, "Oh, I just wish I could talk to her about this. She's the only one I would want to talk to about this." I love to usually say, well, okay, let's pretend that you could talk to her about it. What would she say? Right? Like, what is it that you wish you could hear from her? What is it you need to hear from her? Is there permission you want her to give you? Is there unconditional support you want? Like, what is it that you would want to hear? Because we can imagine that and have the experience of that conversation. Um, again, that's abstract, so it's really only for adults. But I think it can be very, very, very healing when folks are ready to kind of go there with it. All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments about any of that? Okay, y'all have done so great. I only have two more very quick things to share with you, and then we're going to end right on time. In a minute, I am going to ask for a volunteer to read this quote out loud. And so this quote is from a book called, oh, thank you, Vanessa. This quote is from a book called Trauma Stewardship. And so if you have not read this book, I really encourage you to read it. It's in the Free Library of Philadelphia. I don't know about any of the surrounding counties' library systems, but there's an ebook and a physical book. And for those of us who work in high trauma environments, who are working with clients who are impacted by trauma at the intersection of so many systems, we have to take good care of ourselves, right? Like we have to kind of nurture our own stamina. And so I'm going to ask for another volunteer, like I did earlier, to unmute themselves and to read this out loud for us as we close. So whoever you are, who's going to volunteer, you can just unmute and start reading. Do I have any volunteers?
I'll read. I have heard countless colleagues express their despair, frustration, and disbelief that there is not a simple process to follow, a neat package to open, a time-released pill that will make it all better. These feelings of urgency and attraction to something quick and easy are, in and of themselves, a part of the trauma exposure response. In truth, we know that transformation is a process. We know that the people and environments we're working with have a long road ahead of them. We know that our physical health requires daily maintenance, that we should do more than simply seek treatment once things go wrong. And yet, when it comes to caring for ourselves while caring for others, we often choose to believe that somehow we are different. Somehow our capabilities must be greater. Somehow we are entitled to a less arduous, less introspective, less involved role in our own well being. In fact, we are not. Trauma stewardship is based on age old wisdom.
Thank you so much for reading that out loud for us, Hayden. Much appreciated. All right, folks. I put my email address in the chat. I would love for any of you to reach out if you need anything. Marquita, actually, could you put the Hope Line number in the chat too? The Hope Line, the Philly Hope Line is Uplift's centralized intake line. That is the number you can call if you want to refer families. But it also operates, I'm going to share this screen to remind you, it also operates as a free grief and loss emotional support line. It's not a crisis line, but it is a warm line. And so sometimes when we have moved through these conversations, it can bring are in need of any emotional support. We are here for you, not just your clients, but all of you as well. So you can call the line. Our phone line closes at 4 today, but it's open back up again tomorrow at 10 a.m. You can call and say, I was at Catherine's training and it just brought up all of this grief and I really just need to talk to somebody about it who gets it. You don't have to sign up for grief services. You can just call and literally just talk to somebody for as long as you need to. That being said, I am going to share. Perfect. Marquita just put the number in the chat. Again, that's Uplift Center for Grieving Children's number to refer clients to us for grief services or for grief and emotional support just over the phone. You are all also welcome to that number to call us anytime. That being said, I am so thankful for all of your presence and engagement. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see